yet they do. There is a country, though, that threatens America's security, economy, and the freedom of the world. It's not run by Vladimir Putin. It's, of course, China, a nation incalculably more powerful than Russia and one whose aims are grander and far more sinister. China seeks to displace the United States as the world's dominant power. It is well on its way to doing that. Consider the Chinese military. Analysts often dismiss the country's defense spending as a fraction of our own, as if that's a valid measure of the threat it poses to us. In conventional terms, the Chinese military is, in fact, much smaller, fewer bases, ships, and aircraft. But in the battlefield of the future, the anticipated future, China may already have achieved an advantage over us. China is heavily invested in advanced technology with military applications, digital warfare, artificial intelligence, next-generation biological agents that are terrifying. Globally, the Chinese hold the key to much of the internet. The concern isn't that the Chinese army could beat the 101st Airborne in a pitched battle, but that the Chinese government could effectively shut down American weapons systems before the battle even began. Just last week, the Chinese attacked an American military aircraft, not the first time, in Djibouti on the Horn of Africa with lasers. They injured 2 of our airmen. The Chinese military is becoming far more aggressive around the world. In the South China Sea, you may know, they're building artificial islands, putting airstrips on them. The point is to dominate neighboring countries. It's working. Anti-ship cruise missiles, surface-to-air missiles have also been installed. Those threaten U.S. forces in the region, potentially. Even more ominously, China is expanding its military presence here on our doorstep in Latin America, in our hemisphere. The Chinese have sold hundreds of millions in arms, offered military training, held meetings with the commanders of a number of Latin American militaries. China couples all of this with economic incentives throughout Latin America. China, not the U.S., is now the biggest trading partner with Brazil, Chile, Peru. They're using their foothold in our hemisphere to increase their aggressive spying on the U.S. The largest foreign hack of classified data in U.S. history was carried out by Russia? No, by China. FBI Director Christopher Wray recently testified that a massive number of Chinese college students and professors here are actually probably spies for their government. More than 100 U.S. colleges have Confucius Institutes. Those are outposts funded by China whose sole purpose is to promote propaganda from the Chinese government. Your daily newspaper may be doing it too. The Washington Post, for example, not making this up, takes Chinese money to publish China Watch, that is propaganda controlled by the Chinese government. They're not embarrassed. They do it a lot. The root of China's strength comes from its economy, which is booming, and it was built in part on the destruction of our economy. China's economy will soon surpass America's in size. It will be the richest country on Earth soon. The U.S.-China trade imbalance hit a record $375 billion last year. That has increased dramatically since we allowed China into the WTO 20 years ago. Our leaders assured us then that China would become less repressive as it got richer. That hasn't happened. In some ways, the opposite has happened. Meanwhile, many thousands of American businesses have died as a result, whole industries destroyed, and then entire regions of our country destroyed in turn. Now China plans to dominate high-tech manufacturing as well, taking more and better-paying jobs from our country. American companies seem eager to help them do it. Tesla, a company you pay for with your tax dollars, it wouldn't exist without the subsidies, says its next facility built in China, not the U.S. But solar panels and electric cars aren't the only thing that country's making. Most of the world's fentanyl is manufactured in China. The Chinese send it here. Thousands of us die every year from it. The U.S. government has asked them to stop, to prosecute people involved in the fentanyl trade. They've refused. Why would they help? They're winning. China is rising. It's a disaster for the world. It's a catastrophe, potentially, for the United States. It's by far the single biggest threat we face, no matter what they tell you. We're going to spend the next month talking about it in our series on the rise of China. We're starting tonight with the man who may know more about the subject than any other American. Dr. Michael Pillsbury is director at the Center for Chinese Strategy at the Hudson Institute in Washington. He's a White House advisor, author of the book, The 100-Year Marathon, which you should read. Michael Pillsbury joins us in studio. Dr. Pillsbury, thanks a lot for coming on.
Thank you.
Does pushing back against China work?
It's never been tried before until last week. I think President Trump is the first president to actually seek to push back against China. He's doing so on many fronts. I think the trade negotiations are what he's chosen to move on first. This is very difficult because of our own lack of good intelligence about Chinese strategy, whereas they seem to have us basically penetrated politically, economically, even in our, as you mentioned, in our media. They portray themselves as our best friend, and a lot of Americans agree with them. They have inconvenient facts to cover up. One is that they've got more billionaires now than we do. That's quite a shocking statistic when you think about it. It's about 580 Chinese billionaires and 530 American billionaires, according to those who do these statistics. So President Trump is in uncharted waters now. He made his first offer to the Chinese when his delegation went there. The Chinese promptly leaked the offer on social media and then claimed it was outrageous and humiliating, and they would never agree to any of the points. But their delegation is coming here. So the first round has been fought already to President Trump to lay down his demands.
But we're, by your account, and I think you have the definitive account, we're at the late stage of this.
That's right.
And so why did the last 5 presidents allow this to happen without pushing back?
It's complicated reasons. Each one had his own account. President Obama actually was the one who began talking the most about the gangsterization of our companies. I think a lot of major companies are donors to the Democratic Party. It's no surprise. And they complained. But the companies wanted it done quietly. They don't want China to retaliate and harm them because they're complaining. There was another angle, which is the military balance. The Chinese only fairly recently have been quite assertive in space, in cyber, with their new aircraft carrier, their new paratroop exercises that they just ran 2 weeks ago. Now the Pentagon is openly concerned about China. But many secretaries of defense over the years have said there is no China threat.
But military power always follows economic power.
Yes.
So if you see a country becoming predominant in the region economically, you can guess at some point they're going to become predominant militarily, right?
You can, but there's been a strong view in our country that China is going to collapse soon, so there won't be any problem to worry about. The other error we've made is thinking that China had no strategy. They were just kind of a hapless, poor country that was trying to pull up its poor people. You know, of course, they needed our investment.
And the Chinese had no strategy. Kind of an ad hoc culture they have.
Well, that's why I say that we are China's greatest enabler.
Yes.
We're also China's greatest victim.
Are there any large American companies or multinationals based here that are standing up in any way to China?
Quietly. There was a very important leak to the New York Times about 2 years ago of a report that the American Chamber of Commerce in Beijing had compiled with all of the American executives complaining about really bad treatment of American companies in China. It's supposed to be an internal report. Somehow it got on the front page of the New York Times. Chinese got very angry. They began to have high-level meetings saying, this isn't really true, is it? They ask American corporate executives. And of course, to the face of the Chinese, they have to say, no, we love China. But that was an example of somebody blowing the whistle. But notice the kind of caution that had to be exercised at the time.
Why would we kowtow? And we're almost at time, but I just have to ask you almost rhetorically, does the relentless focus on the exaggerated threat from Russia distract, do you think, from a much greater threat that imperils us?
Very much so. The Russians have more nuclear weapons by far, but they don't. Their economy is only about 1/5 the size of our economy or the Chinese economy. So in terms of the comprehensive challenge to us, it's clearly China, sort of 10 to 1, I would say. All this concern with the Russia threat, I have to think, is somewhat of fake news.
But there's a cost to it.
Yes, it distracts us from China. That's the biggest problem.
Michael Pillsbury, I cannot more aggressively recommend your book.
Thank you.
And I hope that our viewers buy it. Thank you for coming on.
I think China does have a strategy.
Yeah, I've noticed.
And it's pretty good.
I bet. Thank you very much. Conservatives are already unwelcome at Google, but they're not alone. Even animal rights activists were accused of racism when they tried to speak there. PETA versus Google.